nobody saw them coming, and nobody ever saw them go. In the quiet, rain-soaked suburbs of Belgium between 1982 and 1985, a group of men committed acts so brutal, so senseless, so deliberately cruel, that an entire nation came apart at the seams trying to explain them. They killed 28 people. They injured 22 more. They robbed supermarkets, restaurants, jewelry shops, and gun stores, sometimes taking less than $6,000. And then, one November night in 1985, they walked into a parking lot in the small city of Aalst, shot a family of 4 for absolutely no reason, laughed while doing it, and drove away into the darkness. They were never caught. To this day, no one knows who they were. No one knows why they did it. And the deeper investigators dug, the more a terrifying possibility began to take shape. One that the Belgian government has never fully denied and never fully confirmed. What if the killers weren't just criminals? What if they were something far worse? What if the people supposed to stop them were the ones letting them through? This is the story of the Brabant Killers, and once you hear it, you will not forget it. Let's go back to the beginning, not to the first murder, but to the moment just before, the eerie, almost mundane calm that preceded 3 years of carnage. It was the winter of 1981. Belgium was in the grip of an economic crisis. The Belgian franc had just been devalued. Unemployment was rising. Street protests were becoming a weekly occurrence, with peace activists marching against the planned deployment of American nuclear missiles on European soil. The country felt fragile, politically unstable, socially anxious, quietly furious. And on the last day of that year, New Year's Eve 1981, someone broke into a gendarmerie barracks in Etterbeek, a municipality just east of Brussels. They weren't looking for cash. They weren't after electronics or valuables. They took automatic weapons, ammunition, and a car. It was a strange, targeted burglary, professional, precise, the kind of break-in that requires inside knowledge of the layout, the schedule, the location of the weapons. Investigators noted it, filed it, and moved on. They would come to regret that decision more than almost anything else, because months later, those weapons, or weapons very like them, would start appearing at crime scenes across the Belgian province of Brabant. And the men carrying them would not behave like any criminals Belgium had ever seen. The first real glimpse of the gang came in the spring of 1982, quiet and almost unremarkable. A shotgun was stolen from a store in Dinant. 2 men were seen running away. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested what was coming. Then in May, a man approached the driver, forced him out of his car at gunpoint, and stole the vehicle. It was brazen enough, But what witnesses remembered most wasn't the gun. It was the man holding it. He wasn't masked. He spoke French, clearly, fluently, with what one witness described as the accent of an educated person. He didn't seem afraid. He seemed almost relaxed. The car was abandoned almost immediately. It wasn't about the car. What was it about then? That question would haunt Belgium for the next 40 years. By August 1982, the gang had crossed into France, robbing a grocery store in Maubeuge. Food and wine, barely worth anything. But when two French police officers arrived at the scene, they were shot, seriously wounded, left bleeding in the street while the gang loaded stolen groceries into their vehicle and drove calmly away. This was the first sign of something deeply wrong. Professional criminals don't shoot police over bottles of wine. The risk isn't worth it. The math doesn't add up, unless the point was never the wine. The point was the shooting. By September 1982, the violence had escalated sharply. The gang raided a weapons dealer in Wavre, Belgium. They stole 15 firearms, including submachine guns. A police officer was killed at the scene. 2 more were shot and seriously wounded when they arrived. The gang didn't panic. They didn't rush. They executed their plan and left. And 3 months later, on a cold December night, they hit a restaurant in Bercel. They stole coffee and wine. And they tortured and killed the caretaker. Tortured for coffee and wine. That detail sat in the reports, and it quietly horrified the investigators who read it. Because torture isn't about theft. Torture is personal. Torture is a message. The question was, to whom? 1983 was the year the gang found its rhythm. And it was a rhythm that made no sense. January, a taxi driver in Brussels, robbed and murdered. The car found later in Mons. February, a supermarket in Rixensart. Less than $18,000 taken. Several people wounded. March, a supermarket in Halle. 1 staff member killed. Less than $18,000 taken. May, a supermarket in Hudeng-Gunier. $22,000. No one killed this time. The pattern was almost domestic in its repetition. Supermarkets, modest amounts of cash, extreme violence. The robbery proceeds were embarrassing relative to the risks being taken. A competent armed gang in Belgium in 1983 could have netted far more money with far less bloodshed by targeting banks or armored vehicles. Instead, these men kept hitting grocery stores and walking away with the equivalent of a decent monthly salary, split between at least 3 people. It made no sense. Unless the money wasn't the point. But then in September 1983, something happened that would become one of the most discussed incidents in the entire case. The gang broke into a textile factory in Temse, Belgium. And what they stole stopped investigators cold. 7 bulletproof jackets. Not money, not electronics. Bulletproof jackets. Jackets that the factory had only recently begun manufacturing, and only for the police. The contract was not publicly known. There was no way a random group of armed robbers should have known that factory was producing body armor for law enforcement. Someone told them. Someone with access to that kind of information. A worker was killed in the raid. His wife was severely wounded. And Belgium's investigators stood in that factory and felt, for the first time, the cold breath of something they couldn't name. 6 days later, the gang struck again. A couple stopped at a 24-hour self-service petrol station. It was late, quiet. The kind of ordinary, forgettable moment that makes up most of a life. They didn't know the gang was burgling the store beside the station. They didn't know the alarm had already been tripped. They stopped their car, and they were murdered. The gang didn't run. That's what one needs to sit with. They didn't run. They took their time loading 20 kilograms of tea and coffee and 10 liters of cooking oil from the store while 2 people lay dying in the petrol station. When 2 gendarmes finally arrived in response to the alarm, they were shot immediately. 1 killed, 1 seriously wounded. The gang then escaped in a stolen Saab, shooting up a pursuing police car, using a little-known back road that required intimate local knowledge to navigate at high speed in the dark. They tried to destroy the Saab afterward by shooting the fuel tank. When that didn't work, they simply abandoned it and disappeared. Investigators recovered the Saab. They collected evidence from it, fingerprints, fibers, potentially crucial material that could have broken the case wide open. And then that evidence disappeared. Not misfiled, not lost in the chaos of a large investigation. Disappeared, gone, as if it had never existed. 2 weeks after the petrol station murders, the gang hit a supermarket in Bersel. 1 customer was killed. Then in December, they walked into a jewelry shop in Anderlus. And the moment they entered, without warning, without any provocation, they shot the owner's wife dead. Then they killed the owner when he tried to defend himself. They destroyed the surveillance camera recording before they left. They were meticulous. They were deliberate. And they were done for the year. In December 1983, the Brabant Killers went silent. The silence lasted nearly 2 years, and in some ways, that silence was the most frightening thing of all. Here is where the story changes. Here is where it stops being a straightforward, if baffling, crime spree, and becomes something else entirely. While Belgian investigators scrambled to make sense of the 1982 and 1983 attacks, a parallel world was quietly unraveling in the background. A world of far-right paramilitary groups, NATO intelligence networks, and men who operated in the shadows between legitimate law enforcement and something far darker. In March 1981, a man named Paul Latinus, young, charismatic, connected, co-founded an organization called Westland New Post. On the surface, it was a far-right political group. Beneath the surface, it was something more structured, more disciplined, more dangerous. It had ties to the Belgian gendarmerie. It had ties to NATO's clandestine stay-behind network, a Cold War infrastructure of secret cells buried across Western Europe, designed to conduct sabotage and resistance operations in the event of a Soviet invasion. These stay-behind networks, later exposed under the name Operation Gladio, were real. They were funded by NATO and the CIA. They maintained weapons caches across Europe. And in countries like Italy, they had already been linked to acts of domestic terrorism, attacks designed not to fight communism abroad, but to frighten civilian populations at home, to push governments towards stronger, more authoritarian security measures, to discredit the political left. The strategy had a name. It was called the Strategy of Tension, and now investigators were beginning to whisper that it had come to Belgium. Westland New Post members later admitted under questioning that they had been ordered by Latinus to conduct covert surveillance of Belgian supermarkets, specifically the large chains that were targeted by the Brabant Killers. They compiled reports on security arrangements, staff patterns, camera placements, guard rotations. They were told it was an exercise in developing clandestine skills. Now, one needs to pause there and sit with that. Members of a far-right paramilitary group with documented ties to NATO intelligence infrastructure conducted detailed reconnaissance of the exact supermarkets that were subsequently massacred by an unidentified gang of killers. And then Paul Latinus, the man who ordered that reconnaissance, committed suicide in April 1984. He was 26 years old. He left no explanation. 3 months after his death, the Westland New Post began to fracture. Key members were arrested. The organization collapsed. And 5 months after that, the Brabant Killers came back. September 27th, 1985. It began on a Friday afternoon, the kind of unremarkable end of week that most people spend thinking about dinner or weekend plans. The Delhaize supermarket on Rue de la Greniette in Braine-l'Alleud was busy with ordinary shoppers when 3 men walked in and the world came apart. The robbery lasted minutes. Less than $6,000 was taken. 3 people were killed. 2 were wounded. The gang left with almost nothing of material value. Less than half an hour later, they hit a second Delhaize supermarket in Overijse, 15 to 25 minutes away. 5 more people killed, 1 wounded. $25,000 taken. In one afternoon, 8 people were dead, shot in supermarket aisles over groceries. Belgium was in shock. The government promised action. Security was immediately increased at stores across the region. Armed guards stationed at entrances, panic buttons installed at checkouts. The whole country felt like it was holding its breath. They should have held it longer. November 9th, 1985. The Delhaize supermarket in Aalst. 7:30 in the evening. Aalst was different from the gang's usual territory. It was further out, beyond the province of Brabant, beyond the area they had always operated in. And the gang knew this store had armed patrols. In fact, when they arrived, a patrol was still present on the premises. They went in anyway. When they emerged from the supermarket, a family was walking through the parking lot toward their car. A mother, a father, their daughter and their young son. They had been shopping. They were going home for dinner. The gang shot the mother, the father, the daughter. All three killed in the car park of a supermarket on a Saturday evening for no reason that any prosecutor, psychologist, or investigator has ever been able to fully explain. The 9-year-old boy, the surviving child, ran back into the store. A gang member followed him, found him, and shot him at point-blank range in the hip. He survived, barely. Inside and outside the store, 8 people were killed that night. Several others were seriously injured. Witnesses described gang members wearing bizarre face paint and strange disguises. They were laughing, smiling, roaring at customers. The main shooter, the one witnesses called the killer, seemed to be enjoying himself. And here is where the second great shadow falls over this case. The armed patrol that had been present at the store, they retreated when the shooting started. A police van eventually pursued the gang's Volkswagen for a few kilometers, and then stopped. The gang escaped through an unblocked exit and vanished. They were never seen again. In the aftermath of Aalst, Belgium fractured, not just in grief, though there was plenty of that. The flowers and candles outside the supermarket, the 9-year-old boy learning to walk again in a hospital room while his parents and sister were buried without him. The fracture was deeper than grief. It was the fracture of trust, because the questions were too loud to ignore now. Why did the armed patrol retreat? Why were exits left unblocked? Why, in a country on high alert after the September massacres, had a gang been able to walk into a supermarket with armed guards, murder 8 people, and drive away? The Belgian parliament launched an inquiry. Journalists began digging. And what they found was a portrait of an investigation in chaos. A chaos that many began to suspect was not entirely accidental. Evidence had disappeared from the Saab. The firearms stolen from the Etterbeek Gendarmerie barracks on New Year's Eve 1981. Some of them turned up later in a garage linked to a former gendarme named Madani Buhush. Buhush, who was also a gun shop owner, had been renting anonymous garages to store stolen cars, stolen weapons, and false license plates, some of which may have been connected to the Brabant Killers. Buhush was also connected to something else. Years before the Brabant Killers began targeting supermarkets, he had been involved in an extortion scheme that included planned IED attacks against the supermarket chain. the same chain that the Brabant Killers would later massacre. He was questioned, investigated, eventually arrested, not for the Brabant killings, but for the murder of an acquaintance who had grown afraid that weapons stolen from him by Buhush had been used in the Brabant attacks. Buhush was released in 1988. The connection to the gang was deemed inconclusive. He died in 2005 in the employ of an old associate from his Westland New Post days. In November 1986, a year after the Aalst massacre, divers searching a canal approximately 30 kilometers outside Brussels made a stunning discovery. Weapons, items, evidence linked to the Brabant Killers attacks. Things that should have been found during the original investigation. But the canal had reportedly been searched already in 1985, and nothing had been found, which meant one of two things. Either the original search had been inadequate, surface level, not the underwater inspection by frogmen that the 1986 search employed. Or someone had placed those items there after 1985, knowing exactly where they needed to go. The argument over this distinction consumed investigators for decades. Because if the second possibility was true, if someone with guilty knowledge had staged that evidence, then the investigation itself had been compromised from inside. In 2019, the retired senior officers who had ordered the 1986 canal search were officially questioned, on suspicion of manipulating the investigation. The original detectives, the men who had spent years hunting the Brabant Killers. Belgium stared at that fact and didn't know what to do with it. One final lead is worth dwelling on because it captures the whole maddening quality of this case. In 2015, a man named Christian Bonkowski died of alcohol-related causes. Before his death, he had made a confession. He claimed to be the giant, the tall, broad leader of the Brabant Killers. He had previously been identified as a suspect as far back as 2000. He had been a member of Groupe Diane, a former Special Forces unit of the Belgian Gendarmerie. Investigators took the confession seriously. They gathered forensic DNA. They collected fingerprints. They ran every test available to modern forensic science. Christian Bonkowski was definitively ruled out as the giant. He was not one of the killers. His confession was false, either delusional or fabricated for reasons that remain unclear. And so the investigation ended exactly where it had always ended. In a question, in an absence, in the maddening silence of three men who killed 28 people, injured 22 more, and then ceased to exist. The investigation was officially closed on June 28, 2024. The statute of limitations, extended specially for this case, ran to 2025, by which point the core gang members would be in their mid-70s at minimum, assuming they were still alive. But on January 28, 2025, federal prosecutors in Belgium announced that a new lead had emerged. A civil party in the city of Mons had appealed to the courts, requesting that 2 additional witnesses be heard. Witnesses who were present at the Aalst attack on November 9, 1985. The appeal was approved. The probe continues. Somewhere, possibly, an old man is alive who walked into a Belgian supermarket in face paint on a November evening in 1985 and shot a 9-year-old boy. Somewhere, possibly, a man who laughed while killing a family in a parking lot is living out his final years in ordinary, unremarkable quiet. And somewhere in the Belgian archives, there are files that have never been fully opened, questions that have never been fully answered, and a canal that gave up its secrets too late. Or perhaps only the secrets it was allowed to give. Here is what we know. We know that 28 people are dead. We know that their families have waited 4 decades for answers that may never come. We know that the investigation was compromised by rivalry, by incompetence, and possibly by something far more deliberate. We know that a paramilitary group with NATO connections surveilled the exact targets the killers would later attack. We know that evidence vanished. We know that the men who were supposed to chase the killers are now themselves suspects in the manipulation of the case. And we know one more thing. The thing that makes this story unlike almost any other unsolved crime in European history. The Belgian Gendarmerie, the National Paramilitary Police Force, the institution at the center of so many unanswered questions surrounding the Brabant Killers, was dissolved in 2001, abolished, folded into a restructured federal police service. One of the official reasons given was the force's unsatisfactory performance in the Brabant Killers case. An entire national police institution dissolved in part because of 3 men in a Volkswagen who were never caught. That 9-year-old boy from the Aalst parking lot, David van de Steen, grew up. He lost his mother, his father, his sister in that car park. He was shot himself and left for dead. And for 25 years, his grandfather Albert fought relentlessly to bring the killers to justice. Their story was eventually made into a Belgian film. David is in his late 40s now. The men who destroyed his family are, if alive, old. And Belgium is still, quietly, officially, searching. Here is the thought that this story leaves behind, the one that tends to stay. In every true crime case, there is a moment when the monster is caught, when the door closes, when justice arrives, when the darkness is finally named and contained. This case has no such moment. The darkness here was never contained. It was simply absorbed into the silence of an unsolved file, into the careers of retired detectives now under suspicion, into the collective memory of a country that was terrorized and was never given a reason why. The Brabant Killers didn't just commit crimes. They committed them in a way designed to be inexplicable. And in that inexplicability, in that carefully engineered absence of motive, They may have left behind the one clue that matters most. Some crimes are too strange to be accidental. Some investigations fail in ways that are too consistent to be coincidental. And some questions, once asked, refuse, no matter how many decades pass, to stay quiet. Who were the Brabant Killers? We still don't know, and maybe, just maybe, that was always the point.